Mr. President, since the shutdown began, we've heard voices on both sides of the aisle, mine included, calling for a bipartisan solution to fund the government and end this stalemate. With Speaker Pelosi and Minority Leader Schumer refusing to even come to the negotiating table, they've made finding common ground much harder than it needs to be. This weekend, President Trump made a serious proposal that would deliver on priorities that are important to both parties, Republicans and Democrats, and bring this partial government shutdown to an end. The bill we voted on today contains key provisions on both border security.
Will the senator suspend?
I will.
The Senate will be in order. Senators, take your conversations off the floor. Senator from Texas.
The bill we voted on today contains key provisions to both bolster border security and make improvements to our immigration system as a whole. As we've heard from the Border Patrol experts time and time again, we need sensible solutions which, along the border, consists of three components. It's physical barriers in some locations, it's technology in others, and personnel in others, or some combination of those three. President Trump himself has said he understands there doesn't need to be a wall from sea to shining sea, and he's acknowledged that the role of technology and personnel in border security. But we need to prevent the illegal movement of goods and people without inhibiting legitimate trade and travel. I'd like to show colleagues just one example of a physical barrier in Texas that was voted on in a bond election in Hidalgo County, Texas. These are folks who live right on the border. They voted to pay for this levee wall. The reason? Because they knew that the levee system had to be improved in order to get insurance companies to write insurance so they could build and develop the property in Hidalgo County, Texas. They also talked to the Border Patrol about what the Border Patrol needed to control the movement of illegal immigration across the border, and they came up with a win-win proposition, a levee wall, which was appropriate, is appropriate at this particular location. But this was voted on as a bond election by the voters in Hidalgo County, Texas, and did not involve spending any federal money. My simple point is there are solutions that can be worked out if we consult the experts, the Border Patrol, to find out what exactly they need for border security that will meet with public approval along the border and represent a win-win. Recently, when the president was in McAllen, Texas, Senator Cruz, my colleague from Texas, and I had a meeting with mayors and county judges after the president's entourage left to come back to Washington, D.C. I remember specifically my friend, Judge Eddie Trevino, the county judge of Cameron County, Texas, that's where Brownsville, Texas is, who said, if it's the Border Patrol and Customs and Border Protection telling us what we need in order to secure the border, we're all in, he said. But if it's people up in Washington, D.C. making political judgments, politicians trying to micromanage how the border can be secured, we remain deeply skeptical. I think that ought to be, those wise words ought to guide us in our discussions going forward. But not only did the legislation that embodied the president's proposal invest in critical components along the border, it included more than $1 billion for improvements and personnel at our ports of entry. You talk to anybody who knows anything about the movement of illegal drugs, heroin, methamphetamine, fentanyl across the border, most of it comes through the ports of entry, embedded in trucks and trailers and personal vehicles. And we need more technology in order to scan those vehicles in secondary review. And we need to be, in order to detect them and deter them, to interdict them, but we need the personnel to be able to do that without impeding legitimate trade and travel. So these are priorities which I've long advocated for based on feedback from the experts, the law enforcement officers, community leaders, and folks who live and work along the Texas-Mexico border every day. But as we all know, the challenges that exist within our immigration system don't end at our borders. With a court backlog of roughly 800,000 cases deep, nearly 1 million people living in the U.S. with temporary legal status, and the loopholes that make enforcing some of our immigration laws nearly impossible. So there is much more that needs to be done. That's why this legislation includes provisions to build the foundation of real immigration reform, something heralded by both parties. This bill generously granted provisional status to current DACA and temporary protected status recipients who live each day not knowing if or when they be forced to leave the United States. It does not offer a path to citizenship or a long-term solution. I wish we could do that, but we don't have a long-term solution. But it does provide stability for 3 years while Congress works on a legislative fix. So this is far from a solution to the pervasive problems in our immigration system, but it is a start. And a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step, and this represents a first step. Most importantly, though, this legislation funds the departments and agencies that have been shuttered since December the 22nd. This shutdown may have begun as a battle over border security, but it's affecting men and women in all 50 states whose jobs have nothing to do with border security as well. People at the Department of Agriculture, the Justice Department, the Interior Department, Housing and Urban Development, Treasury. There's NASA, the National Space Agency, and the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Food and Drug Administration, the Peace Corps. All of the people working for each of these government agencies are working without pay or have been furloughed. Not only is the partial shutdown impacting the critical work being done by these departments and agencies, it's harming the dedicated men and women who work there, those tasked with executing and enforcing laws written by this very body. Mr. President, the Senate's not in order.
Senate will be in order.
Mr. President, since the shutdown began 34 days ago, more than 800,000 federal workers have lost the security of knowing when their next paycheck will come. Tomorrow is the second paycheck they'll miss, meaning they have now gone more than a month without income. Yesterday, when I was in Austin and then in Dallas, I was told that people who routinely volunteer their time at the food bank in those locations now find themselves going to the food bank and seeking food so they can feed their families because they're missing a government paycheck and can't provide for them without the generosity of those food banks. I also went to events in Austin and Dallas, met with the U.S. attorneys in both of those locations, talking about our efforts to counter human trafficking and child exploitation. What I learned is that the prosecutors, the frontline prosecutors who prosecute these kinds of cases aren't being paid. But maybe more troublesome is the fact that either are the FBI agents that conduct the investigations or the administrative personnel that support the U.S. attorney's offices. So this is harming our ability to investigate and prosecute human trafficking and child exploitation cases too. People are being forced to work without pay, and it's harming not only them, but the victims of these horrific crimes. Mr. President, the Senate's not in order. Mr. President, more than 110,000 of these unpaid federal workers earn less than $50,000 a year, and they rely on their paycheck to make ends meet. They are not millionaires. While we did pass legislation to guarantee that these public servants will eventually get their pay, that does nothing to help them in the interim. Federal workers are forced to make decisions that no family should have to consider. For a single mom who's a federal correctional officer in Arizona, that means turning off her heat, never letting the temperature get higher than 60 or 65 degrees in order to cut costs. For a mom in Wisconsin who works in the Department of Interior, that means rationing her insulin because she can't afford the $300 copay. This shutdown is deeply impacting thousands of federal workers and their families all across the country, including Texas. For one Texan who works at the Internal Revenue Service, he says he's been sleeping in, so he only has to worry about eating 2 meals a day, not 3. One woman whose husband is in the Coast Guard drove from Galveston to Ellington Field, that's in Houston, about 40 miles each way to pick up free diapers for their kids. On a recent trip home, I heard specific examples about the impact the shutdown has had on the Department of Justice, which I mentioned just a moment ago, and the heartbreaking challenges they are facing every day. These dedicated men and women have chosen their careers in public service. They want to go to work. They want to be able to pay their bills. And it's time for us to do our job so they can do theirs with the dignity and the pay that they earn. I'd like to remind all our colleagues that our constituents did not send us to Washington so we could simply vote no on a less than perfect piece of legislation. If that were the case, we'd never get anything done here. We were elected to work with our colleagues to create legislation so we can get to yes, to build consensus, and to solve problems, not to score political points. Are there certain pieces of legislation that I don't agree with? Well, of course. But parts of this legislation that we just voted on. But it does fund priorities critical to our southern border and to the people of Texas. And right now, this is the only bill that I've seen that includes priorities of both parties that carries the president's support. I voted for this legislation to support the men and women who have been treated as collateral damage throughout this unnecessary government shutdown. Those who are forced to apply for food stamps or unemployment, who would rather be working, who can't pay their medical bills or child care, who not only want this shutdown to end, they need for this shutdown to end. We aren't here to hold show votes on legislation that the president won't sign. Just ask the elementary school civics students, and they can tell you that's not how a bill becomes a law. This was a serious offer by the president to end this shutdown and build the trust and goodwill necessary to have real reform. And I'm disappointed that our colleagues voted against this bill. That was a vote not on the merits of the president's proposal. That was a vote to get on the bill so it could be amended. In other words, our colleagues who voted against the bill aren't even interested in having a conversation about how we solve this problem and how we find our way out of this box canyon. And unfortunately, there are those who, for political reasons, continue to lack any interest in negotiating a compromise bill that can earn bipartisan support. We solve difficult problems every day in the United States Congress on a bipartisan basis, every single day. But somehow, we've decided we can't solve this problem, and I only fear that it's not because of the difficulty of the problem presented, it's because of the politics that have paralyzed us and made it impossible for us to bridge our differences. I thank the President for this comprehensive offer and the Majority Leader for bringing it to the floor so we can vote on it, And I would urge all of our colleagues now that we've had these 2 failed votes, we know we're right where we started when we got here today, that we work together to try to bridge our differences, to build consensus, and end this shutdown. Mr. President, I yield the floor.